I can't tell you how many software engineers I worked with who will just have these temper tantrums like children because they just don't know how to manage their emotions. And so you'll say something to set them off and they'll be gone for a day. So you'll lose a day of productivity, which is really expensive given software engineering salaries, only because this person, hasn't been taught how to manage difficult emotions.
Welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Sampofo. Today we're here with April Wensel. She's the founder of Compassionate Coding and also a software engineer whose work has spanned the education, research, healthcare and entertainment sectors. With Compassionate Coding, April has devised a suite of strategies that harness the power of compassion to build effective software development teams. You should listen to this show if you want to find out more ways to improve your digitised working culture, what drives passive-aggressive characters, and how you can make your team more effective. But before we start, welcome to Digital Mindfulness, where we bring together the best thought leaders from around the world to teach you how to be your best self in an age of digital distraction and information overload. If you like what we're going to be talking about on this episode, then come and hang out with us in London at the Digital Mindfulness Live Conference on the 24th to 25th of May. Over 2 days, we'll have workshops, keynotes, and plenty of opportunities to connect with the digital mindfulness community, with leading experts and companies to be talking about improving health, well-being, design, communication, and collaboration in this age of digital distraction. The event is selling out quickly, so if you're interested in coming, email me on lawrence@digitalmindfulness.net so that you can plan ahead. Looking forward to meeting you here in London. Hi April, thanks so much for being here with us today at Digital Mindfulness. It's a pleasure to have you on here and find out more about Compassionate Coding.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So April, I wonder if you can tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, how you came to coding, and particularly how you came to dovetail the two areas of compassion and the contemplative community with coding.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So I got into coding partly because I had a computer at a young age. So when I was a kid, I had a computer and I wasn't coding originally, but I would use the command line, so typing in text commands, which is a good precursor for coding. And once I got into high school, luckily my school offered computer science. So I took it as soon as I could, which was my sophomore year. So for 3 years in high school, I took computer science and I just took to it immediately. What really appealed to me was the ability to learn this new language, to communicate ideas and create interactive experiences. So that was the exciting thing for me and why I just fell in love with coding. So I continued on into college, graduated with a CS major, but at a liberal arts school, Pomona College. So I got a nice balance there of the humanities and technology. And then I went straight into working in tech. So I've been working in tech to some degree for the past 10 years. And including leadership positions at various companies. It's also, I have worked at a number of different types of places, so mostly small startups, but also some larger tech companies and research institutions. And what some people refer to as the classic job hopper, and that, in the past 10 years, I've had like 9 different jobs. But to me, I kind of am proud of that fact because I know when to leave a situation and I don't stay in life's too short to stay in a situation where you're unhappy. But so part of what I've observed over these years and part of why I've had to leave companies is just the unhealthy culture in tech. And so that's kind of what led me to start Compassionate Coding. So that when I mention the unhealthy culture, there are a number of facets to this. The first one that was the most glaring to me was kind of the lack of diversity in tech, which people are starting to recognize now that, there aren't enough women in tech, there aren't enough people of color, and there's no fundamental reason for this. It's not that people in marginalized groups aren't good at technology. That's not really the problem. The problem is the culture. And part of that culture, which is another issue, is the kind of ego and arrogance of software engineers. And I can say that because I am one, and I've definitely suffered from that myself. Silicon Valley creates this kind of pedestal to put software engineers on, like they're these like special geniuses or something. And the truth is they're not, software engineering is just a skill that anyone can learn. So I don't think it's healthy to put them, in this light, but that's currently what happens. I also, throughout my years, have seen blatant ethics violations at companies, and also just when people sweeping them under the rug. There's a lack of sensitivity to users. So an article came out recently about Silicon Valley's empathy vacuum. It was in the New Yorker. And one example they gave was that Facebook, would show pictures of somebody's dead children, right? And nobody kind of thought about that because people at Facebook aren't really thinking of this human element. And then on like a day-to-day basis, there's just the stress. So software engineers themselves are constantly stressed out. And people working in tech in general are constantly stressed out, anxious. And then there's kind of the more subtle issues, which are a lack of concern for the people displaced by tech. So when we have self-driving cars or, automated truck delivery systems, we're going to put a lot of people out of work, right? And a lot of times there's no consideration of that within these companies. And then you have the subtle thing of coexisting as a tech startup with these, horrible social issues, like homeless people in San Francisco is a good example. So, we're going to our offices in these tech startups in San Francisco and playing our foosball and getting our free snacks and free drinks. And then you walk outside and somebody's, suffering on the street there. And there's just, we kind of just ignored that fact. And then, of course, there's all the issues that you discuss on your show, which are, the distractions that technology creates. And I think part of that is just the people behind the scenes who don't really have an understanding of how what they've built is going to affect people. And that's why, shows like yours are so necessary, because now we kind of have to grapple with this. So I noticed all of these issues in tech, and I noticed there's one unifying kind of thread to it, which is a lack of concern for people, as I've been mentioning. And so that's kind of why I thought the solution here is compassion. And I actually hadn't thought much about compassion in my life, just because I'm not religious. I wasn't raised religious. And so a lot of times that's where people learn about it. I learned about it because I became vegan last year. And veganism is kind of a path to compassion to end the suffering of animals. And so that's what kind of introduced me to the idea of this compassion and how it differs from empathy, and that it's, taking it to the next level of trying to end suffering. And so that's where I got that specific concept from.
So April, talk, if you would, now about compassionate coding as an organization. What is it and why is it so important, and where are you now?
Sure. Yeah. So that's very true. That these issues are all connected, and they do come from the people making the technology ultimately, because they're the kind of ones making these changes in the world, creating this technology. And an interesting thing I learned recently is that it's no accident that the people behind technology don't give as much concern to people. IBM in the 60s, which led the way in terms of, setting the standard of how to hire people. In the 60s, they hired a firm that created an aptitude test. And one of the measurements they found that the people who were currently programming had a disinterest in people. And so that kind of became part of the hiring culture, was they look for people who have a disinterest in people. So compassionate coding is kind of trying to rectify some of the damage that's been done. So what we do is right now is run workshops at companies on how to get back to a concern for human beings. And so the way that plays out is I'll run workshops and help people take that step back from the day-to-day rushing to meet deadlines and to growth hack and all of that, and take a minute to really get in touch with their core values, because I have this belief that I think people at their core are good, and that kind of drives everything I do. I'm not sure I've always thought that way, but I've come to think that way. And so, and compassion actually led me to that, because I think when people do things that are hurtful, it's because of suffering in themselves. And so I think if we can get people to really get in touch with their core values, the deep core values, like companies will say, oh, we value efficiency. And it's like, well, yeah, that's good to value. But, what's beneath that? Where's the where's the meaning, and so some of the workshops involve that. Also, just communication on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, a lot of times people in this culture are kind of not aggressive, but just kind of abrasive. That's a term that people have used to describe me in the past, abrasive. Of course, that was before I discovered compassion, but it's common among software engineers to kind of communicate in a very direct way that's kind of like how we would communicate with a computer. So you don't have any sensitivity to how people are feeling. And although we think this is the most efficient way, the problem is when you communicate in this very direct way without any kind of consideration or empathy with the person's feelings, you can sometimes trigger their threat response. And once somebody's threat response is triggered, they're not really going to be listening to what you say. So it's really actually not the most efficient way to communicate. So that's one thing we cover in the workshops too, is how to communicate more effectively. This ties into, nonviolent communication, things like that. And so that's part of it as well.
That's a really interesting point you were just speaking about, the fact that that we speak to each other, we speak to our colleagues as if we're talking to machines, in that very direct and abrasive way that we expect things right now. And I can just imagine that when we speak to each other in that way, that leads to all kinds of inefficiencies, leads to all kinds of breakdowns in communications. And that overall, it just takes us much longer to do what we're meant to be doing. And that it's just an overall negative impact, not only for our relationships, but for the business as well.
Yeah, you're totally right with that, which is why a lot of times, because I have a lot of friends who work in tech but are not on the engineering side. And there's all kinds of, horrible things they say about the engineers on their team, like, because they just come across as so, like I said, abrasive and just hard, like not understanding or sympathetic to like the needs of salespeople or marketing people or business people in general. And that really, to be honest, is part of the ego issue that I mentioned earlier, which is just there's this idea among software engineers that, we're the smart ones, and it pains me to say that, but I've been in these conversations and I know that there's this dismissive there's this dismissive attitude towards the people who don't code, and it permeates. It's like pervasive in the industry among software engineers, and that's part of what I'm trying to change too. Is because I think one thing with mindfulness is when you really take a step back and look at the situation. It's you kind of it's easy to separate from your ego a little bit once you really get in touch with yourself and whatnot. You kind of see the separation between your ego and kind of the wider world. And so that's why mindfulness specifically is so important to this too.
So April, for people that don't really know, what does a compassionate coder or what does compassionate coding actually look like?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So part of it is kind of that egoless thing that I just mentioned. That's one component of it, which is, Gerald Weinberg wrote this book, The Psychology of Computer Programming in the 70s, and he shared this idea of egoless programming where, your ego is not tied to what you're doing. And so that's definitely part of it. I'd say compassionate coders give consideration to the feelings of the people they're interacting with. They care about their users, so they care about the people they're building the software for. They care about their coworkers. They care about the people indirectly affected by technology, like those displaced people, people whose jobs are displaced by technology. They care about ethics, and they're introspective, and they have a level of emotional intelligence, which is covered in the workshops, emotional intelligence and how to grow that. And I think those are kind of the key components. Another one is the growth mindset. So this is something that Carol Dweck wrote this book, Mindset, about the growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And the growth mindset is part of the issue here because software engineers, part of the culture is thinking, well, you either are good at coding or you're not good at coding, and you're born with it or you're not. And that's a really unhealthy thing, which leads to some of this this like negative energy in the whole industry. And so the growth mindset says you can get better at anything. So that's why I'm a big supporter of boot camps and things like that. So I think a compassionate coder is willing to help junior developers too, and has a general respect for everybody. and which sounds like pretty basic, like, everyone should do that, but it's surprisingly rare among software engineers, unfortunately.
So April, we've been talking a lot about culture, and I'm wondering why you think this kind of aggressive and passive aggressive culture exists, and why it's so pervasive in the workplace, like when it's really obvious that it's counterproductive to helping people do what they're actually meant to be doing.
Part of it is the pressure. So, for example, deadline pressure. When startups are competing against each other, there's a lot of pressure there. But also, it's so deeply ingrained in the leadership. So people who are kind of abrasive and whatnot are kind of seen as respectable because, oh, they must be the expert because they have this like negative attitude, because of the pattern over time. It's kind of like people pattern match, and they see, oh, whenever there's like a grumpy older guy, he's the good coder because he knows what he's talking about. He must be grumpy because he knows so much. Like I wrote an article not too long ago on the toxic tone problem in tech, and somebody commented, and it was really perceptive. He said, well, we have to be this way because, quote, curmudgeons get respect. And that's kind of unfortunately true, which is that this kind of behavior is rewarded. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's job postings around Silicon Valley, and I imagine this extends to the rest of the world, but they were looking for rock star ninja developers. And this doesn't help matters, right? Because that kind of it contributes to that ego issue, which, a rock star isn't there to help the junior developer or mentor people, right? The rock star is there to shine on his own, or her own, but in general, it's him in these cases. So it's just kind of a vicious cycle of the people already there this way, and then they hire people that are like them because of like they self-select for people similar to them, which is phenomenon. And then and so that's and then you combine that with the pressure like of the deadlines and competition and all of that, and kind of showing yourself to be a kind person is not as rewarded because companies don't always see the connection to the bottom line. And so that's part of the issue. But there is a connection, right? Because as you mentioned, when you communicate in like overly direct and insensitive ways, you're actually causing more problems, because when you cause conflict in the workplace, you're losing hours and dollars to conflict. I can't tell you how many software engineers I worked with who will just have these temper tantrums like children because they just don't know how to manage their emotions. And so you'll say something to set them off and they'll be gone for a day. So you'll lose a day of productivity, which is really expensive given software engineering salaries, only because this person, hasn't been taught how to manage difficult emotions.
I think it's really interesting that when we're in school or in university, we're taught all of the hard skills needed for the workplace. We're taught how to code. We're taught how to run campaigns or whatever it is that we have to do to produce things in the workplace. But these other skills, which might be considered softer, in terms of learning to collaborate, learning to communicate well, these aren't really taught, and it's to the detriment not only of our working relationships but also of the business as well.
Yeah, I do think that's in general the case. I think some companies are working on that. Clearly companies that I've worked with, like they see that it's an issue and they care enough, but there's other work being done too. I know Salesforce at their Dreamforce conference last year, they had a whole day of compassion, mindfulness type things. They had Buddhist monks come and do a little chant and things like that. I know Google has employed mindfulness experts, but still, even and LinkedIn has a conscious business academy, which is really interesting. Facebook has the compassion team, but that's kind of a separate team. So a lot of these are all great things and show that there's great progress being made, but they're definitely not being applied across the board. And they're kind of seen as these special programs rather than what I'm trying to encourage, which is this should affect you on a day-to-day basis in how you communicate with people, right? Like communicate in a kind way. That's something you can do every single day at work. That's not something that you go and meditate for 30 minutes once a week or something like that. It's more like this should inform your everyday life, and I don't think that's really happening.
So, April, you've spoken about all of these programs that are available in other organizations, and I know that they kind of have varying degrees of success, but it's really good that they're even established in the first place. But I'm wondering what the response has been to compassionate coding. How have people found it after they've taken the course?
Yeah, well, one thing that I do differently is when I do these workshops with companies, I also engage them for a few months afterwards to and offer my support to kind of help them integrate it. So I do check-ins with them to see if this is happening on a day-to-day basis, because I think one thing that's really important with anytime you learn these things is encouraging it to be applied on a day-to-day basis. So if the company has existing structures like a management structure with one-on-ones, if this is something that the company wants to integrate, then that's a good place to check in about it, is at those regular one-on-ones with your reports, right? To ask them if they've been using this. And I'd say another thing that I try to provide is a shared vocabulary so that people can say, oh yeah, this is an example of, when we should use, I language, not you language, things like that, so that people feel comfortable not calling out, because that's obviously has negative connotations, but pointing out when somebody's not applying these principles, or rather when there's an opportunity to apply these principles on a day-to-day basis. So it's definitely a challenge. And I think like anything, the only way to motivate people to do this, and especially this is true with adult learners, is to get them to see the benefit in their life. So I try in my workshops to give somebody a taste of what it feels like to be able to, be in a stressful situation and then relax, and be able to look at it at a distance, kind of with that detachment that mindfulness allows. And so if they get a taste of what it's like, they can get a sense of what the benefit will be. And then if you combine that with checking in on a regular basis, you have a better chance of success. But it's definitely something that requires motivation. And I think there's a lot of resistance to it, to be honest, which is probably why some of these other companies that I mentioned, why like Google, for example, I know a lot of people that work at Google, and none of them seem to have participated in, or at least remember or care about their mindfulness program, right? So, why is that? I don't know. Some of them are kind of dismiss it, because as I'm sure you're familiar with, there's some resistance and kind of stereotypes around things like mindfulness. I live in Northern California, so luckily most people don't look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about, doing meditation. But in other parts of the world, it's only recently been getting, kind of acceptance, more broad acceptance. And so that might be part of the issue too, is just kind of destigmatizing it a bit, maybe. And like I said too, the business world in general, but also tech, is very much like a competitive, aggressive industry. And so you don't want to show any vulnerability. And I think that these programs, to really be effective and to become a, more balanced, mindful person, you do have to show your vulnerability, So, yeah.
So you were saying there that a lot of people actually find it quite difficult to maintain their practice, or to maintain that feeling that they get after stepping out of a compassionate workshop. So what would you say to people like that? What would you say are some of the benefits of being a compassionate coder?
Yeah, so I think on the individual basis, I think the biggest benefit is it helps with stress, and it helps reduce stress, because when you are more compassionate, because that includes self-compassion, and that's something that I think that's something that even as compassion gains popularity, self-compassion is sometimes overlooked, because it's very important to be compassionate with yourself. And part of this, Kristen Neff, has a book called Self-Compassion. And one of the things that stood out most to me about that book and brought me the most comfort was she says, even when your suffering comes about because of a bad decision you've made, you still deserve self-compassion. And this is powerful to me because as somebody who, at least, early on in school and everything, I always saw myself as a high achiever, and I could not make any mistakes and I had to be perfect. This was very comforting. So I was thinking, well, if I mess up, I'm not automatically a bad person and whatnot. I can have compassion for myself because I I did it for this reason or that reason. It doesn't excuse whatever I've done wrong, but it means I don't have to beat myself up. And so I think that's one thing, is that just it reduces your stress, and that's good for your health. It also makes you more productive, because when you're stressed, you're kind of in that survival mode, and then you can't see more creative solutions to your problem because you're stuck in survival mode. And so that's one benefit to on a personal level. And then on a team level, one thing I mentioned before, that people, used to call me abrasive and stuff, which is something that happens to women more often than men in the workplace. But rather than make it acceptable for women to be abrasive in the workplace, I'd rather just help everybody become less abrasive and more compassionate. But it just helps you communicate better with your coworkers. People will listen to you. And that's, even if you're coding on a computer most of the time, you're still going to have to negotiate trade-offs in terms of what features you're implementing, or deadlines, when you're going to meet them. And so if you can speak in a way that starts from understanding what the person you're talking to is, what their concerns are and what their needs are, you're more likely to get what you want, so to speak. And so there's a benefit there. And, there's a lot of research out lately. There's a book called The Optimistic Workplace by Sean Murphy, and he alludes to research that positive environments are more productive. So companies who embrace this kind of concept can expect higher productivity in their people, because they do have that calmness to be open to more creative solutions. And they're not going to lose all that money that companies lose to conflict over a year, because of course there will still be some conflict, but it will be easier to resolve if people don't blow up and yell at each other. I mean, I don't think there's any place for yelling in the workplace, yet many companies that I've worked for, if not the norm, it was definitely something that happened. And that's something that compassion helps with too. It also just, it's very heavy to carry around resentments of people. And there's a lot of things that anger people who work on technology. Like, if you have to deal with legacy code, which is code written in the past that may not be well tested, it may not be well written. Some people develop resentment for the people who wrote the code, or a resentment at the task. And that's a heavy thing to carry. So if you can release resentment by having compassion for everything that people do, even horrible things, it just takes the weight off your shoulders. And this makes everybody more productive. So, and then finally, one thing this really does help with is create an inclusive environment, because part of the issue, I think, diversity and inclusion in tech is clearly something that needs to be worked on. But I actually think it's more of a symptom of a problem than the problem itself, because I think it's a symptom of this culture that we've been discussing. And so I think if companies are willing to embrace this compassionate approach to communication, they're more likely to attract and retain diverse talent. Because how do you deal with somebody who's different from you? Well, you have empathy and compassion for them. And so I think you're less likely to lose employees, women and people of color who join your team, because the other people on the team are better able to understand the circumstances and whatnot that person, and their background and where they're coming from, and be more sympathetic and empathetic to that situation. So that's another benefit, is the diversity and inclusion angle.
So what would you say, April, are some of the key takeaways that people can do to be a compassionate coder right now in their own jobs?
Yeah, so I think, one, I have a website where I talk about a lot of these ideas. It's compassionatecoding.com. And I would say that, and I include a lot of references there, but some good places to start are books that I've mentioned. So I think if you, The Optimistic Workplace by Sean Murphy is a great one. So people can start applying that immediately. Mindset by Carol Dweck is another good one. Self-compassion that I mentioned. And Karen Armstrong, who created the Charter for Compassion, she has a great book called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And that has a lot of good ideas in it. And including, it mentions how to build, or it raises the question of a compassionate company and what that would mean, and how to not treat people like cogs in the wheel, but rather as human beings. So I think that's another great resource. But yeah, and also anybody can feel free to reach out to me, even just to talk. make my contact info widely available. It's april@compassionatecoding.com. And I always love to talk with people about this because I just want this change to happen. You know what I mean? And I'm willing to help in any way I can. Yeah.
So, April, in this age of digital distraction and hyperconnectivity, what would you say are the most important human qualities, I guess, in addition to compassion, and how do we cultivate those?
I would actually say that I think what's really important is the ability to get in touch with your core values, whatever they are. So I think that kind of plays into self-awareness, because it is easy in this age of digital distraction, as you mentioned, to kind of follow what the crowd is saying and, to believe what you read. Because of our recent election here in the States, people are talking about fake news and how that affected the election, because people just kind of read what they do on the internet and then kind of believe it. So I think having a strong sense of self, so your self-awareness, and a care about other people, so compassion, I think with those combined, I think that the future, if people can grow those qualities, like the future is going to be a much happier place.
That's great, April. So just one more time, where can people get in touch with you and find you?
So the best place is compassionatecoding.com. And I also have a Twitter account at April Wensel. So people can reach out to me there, fairly active on Twitter.
Well, thanks again, April, for coming on the show and being a part of Digital Mindfulness. I really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you. And thank you for making this podcast. I mean, this is part of the solution to the problem. So thank you so much for what you do.
Thanks for being with us today. Remember, you can connect with us on Twitter at Digital Mindful and also on Facebook. If you like the show, don't forget to reach out and thank April. Remember, if you want to find out more about Digital Mindfulness Live, reach out to me on lawrence@digitalmindfulness.net and I'd be more than happy to help you out. See you all for next week's show.